A decorated army colonel, a fallen soldier's remains, and a flight he was denied. What happened next shook the entire country. The airport was packed. Families dragging rolling suitcases, business travelers glued to their phones, kids running ahead of exhausted parents. The usual chaos. Colonel David Carter stepped inside, his polished dress shoes clicking against the tile floor. He had been through this routine too many times before, but today was different. The weight on his chest wasn't just from the ribbons and medals on his uniform, it was from the casket waiting on the tarmac, draped in the American flag. Private First Class Jason Reynolds, 21 years old, gone too soon. Colonel Carter adjusted his hat and took a deep breath. He had a job to do, a duty, one that went beyond rank or recognition. It wasn't about him. It was about the promise made to every soldier who never made it home. No one gets left behind. He approached the airline counter, setting down his military orders and ID. The woman behind the desk barely glanced at him at first. She typed something into the computer, frowning. Then she looked up. A pause. Just a split second too long. "Sir, can I see that again?" Her voice was tight. Carter handed over the papers once more, watching her closely. The flicker of hesitation. The sideways glance at her co-worker. The slight shift in her posture, as if she had just stepped into something she wasn't prepared for. She turned, whispering something to another agent. He glanced over, his expression unreadable. The moment stretched, thick with something Carter had seen before but never got used to. When she returned, her smile was stiff, forced. "I'm sorry, sir, but there seems to be an issue with your ticket. We can't allow you to board at this time." Carter exhaled slowly. He had dealt with all kinds of situations, combat zones, foreign diplomacy, political entanglements. But this was different. "I'm escorting the remains of a fallen soldier," he said evenly, tapping the paperwork. "Everything is in order." The agent didn't meet his eyes. "I understand, sir, but there's a security protocol in place and we can't override it." Carter kept his voice steady. "Security protocol?" "Yes, sir," she said, forcing another weak smile. "It's just policy." He didn't move, didn't flinch. Policy. What policy? Behind him, the line was growing. People shifting, murmuring. He felt their eyes on him. But instead of stepping aside, he squared his shoulders and stood firm. He wasn't leaving without an answer. But the airline staff wasn't backing down either. The air around the counter felt heavier now. Conversations in the line behind him had started to quiet down as people took notice. A man in a crisp military uniform being denied his flight wasn't something you saw every day. Colonel Carter remained calm, his voice steady. "Ma'am, I need to understand exactly what the issue is. This is a military assignment, not a personal trip. My documentation is valid." The agent hesitated again. Her eyes darted toward the other airline staff huddled near the back, whispering. A supervisor, a man in his mid-50s with a tired expression, finally stepped forward. He adjusted his name tag, then folded his arms as he glanced at Carter. "Sir, I apologize for the inconvenience," he started, his voice laced with that professional tone people used when they wanted you to stop asking questions. "But we have certain policies in place, and unfortunately, we can't override them at this time." That phrase again. Policies. Carter inhaled slowly through his nose. He had seen this before, just in a different setting. "I've flown with military escorts before," he said, keeping his frustration buried under years of discipline. "I know the procedure, and I know there's no policy stopping me from boarding. So let's be honest. What's the real reason I'm being denied?" The supervisor cleared his throat and shifted on his feet. "It's just an extra security measure. Nothing personal, sir." Nothing personal. That was rich. Carter tightened his jaw but didn't let the anger take over. He had been in too many rooms where people hid behind vague explanations like this. They were testing his patience, waiting for him to lose his temper, to give them a reason to call security. He wasn't going to give them that satisfaction. The people in line were watching now. A woman in a red blazer whispered something to her husband. A young man holding his boarding pass frowned, glancing at the airline employees like he was trying to make sense of what was happening. Then a voice cut through the tension. "Sir, do you have an issue with his military clearance?" Carter turned his head slightly. A man a few spots behind him in line had spoken up. He was older, maybe mid-60s, with a weathered face and a USMC hat pulled low over his brow. A Marine. A veteran. The supervisor looked uncomfortable. "No, sir, this isn't about clearance. We just have to follow standard protocol." The Marine let out a sharp breath. "Yeah? I've been through security 1,000 times, and I've never seen protocol stop a soldier from escorting one of our own home." He folded his arms. "So what is it?" More murmurs spread through the line. People started pulling out their phones, recording. The shift in the air was palpable. The staff behind the counter could feel it too. The agent who had originally denied Carter stole a glance at her supervisor, looking unsure now. The supervisor sighed, rubbing a hand over his temple. He looked at Carter again, the weight of the moment settling in. "Let me check something," he muttered before walking off. The agent at the counter kept her gaze down, suddenly very interested in her computer screen. Carter didn't move. He stood tall, shoulders squared, staring straight ahead. He wasn't going anywhere. But neither was this story. The murmur in the terminal was no longer just background noise. It was focused, charged. People in line were no longer just waiting for their flights. They were watching, recording. The Marine who had spoken up earlier wasn't the only one who looked irritated. A middle-aged woman in a denim jacket clutching her purse shook her head and leaned toward her husband. "This isn't right," she muttered. "He's in uniform." A younger man in a hoodie pulled out his phone and started typing, his fingers moving fast. People were taking notice, and that was dangerous for the airline. Carter kept his expression unreadable, but inside, he was taking note of every detail. The supervisor hadn't returned yet, which meant one of two things. He was either scrambling for an excuse or waiting for this to die down. Neither was going to happen. Then a voice came from behind him. "Excuse me, sir?" Carter turned his head slightly. A young woman, no older than 25, was standing a few feet away, phone in hand, her eyes uncertain but determined. I don't mean to intrude, but I just want to make sure I understand. They're not letting you board." Her voice wasn't loud, but the way she said it, careful, deliberate, made people nearby pay even more attention. Carter exhaled, glancing at the agent behind the counter. "That's correct." The young woman blinked, as if she expected to hear a different answer. She hesitated for just a second, then nodded once, and turned her phone screen toward him. "I'm live right now," she said. "People need to see this." And just like that, the floodgates opened. Another man held up his phone. "This is wrong," he said, shaking his head. "This man is literally escorting a fallen soldier." A woman further back raised her voice. "Hey, excuse me?" She waved her hand toward the counter. "Can someone explain why he's being denied?" A few people shifted uncomfortably, clearly unsure whether they should get involved. But the energy in the room had changed. What started as quiet murmurs had grown into something bigger, something the airline staff could no longer ignore. The agent behind the counter looked like she wanted to shrink into the floor. Her hands were frozen over the keyboard, eyes flickering to the camera lenses pointed in her direction. Then, the Marine from earlier took a step forward. He was done playing nice. "I've seen a lot of things in my time," he said, voice steady but firm. "But I never thought I'd see the day when an American soldier, especially one escorting the remains of a brother in arms, was treated like this." The terminal had gone eerily quiet. Even the usual airport announcements over the speakers seemed distant, muted. The only sound was the recording beeps from phones capturing every second of what was unfolding. The Marine squared his shoulders. "This is a disgrace." The agent swallowed hard. Her fingers trembled as she clicked at her keyboard again. The supervisor, still nowhere to be seen. Passengers whispered. A baby fussed in its stroller. But the mother, instead of soothing the child, was staring at her phone, reading something with a look of disgust on her face. Then, somewhere in the back of the line, a man muttered, "It's already trending." Carter didn't move. He didn't need to. The world was watching now. The tension in the terminal was thick. The supervisor was still gone, the airline staff stuck in awkward silence. Phones were out, recording, tweeting, streaming. And then, like a spark hitting dry grass, it spread. The young man in the hoodie, still glued to his phone, let out a low whistle. "Damn, this is everywhere now." Carter didn't react. He knew better than to celebrate too soon. But from the way the agent behind the counter stiffened, he could tell she knew it too. The woman in the denim jacket checked her phone and gasped. "Oh my God," she whispered to her husband. "It's already on Facebook." The older Marine grunted, pulling out his own phone. They don't even know what kind of storm they just started. Then, as if on cue, the airport's loudspeaker crackled to life. "Attention passengers. Due to unforeseen circumstances, Flight 237 to Phoenix will be delayed. We apologize for any inconvenience." A few groans rippled through the crowd, but most people weren't even paying attention. Their focus was here, on the uniformed soldier being refused a flight while carrying out his duty. A minute later, a young woman near the windows gasped. "He's on Twitter." She turned her screen toward the crowd, and people leaned in. A tweet, written in bold capital letters. "They just denied a black U.S. Army colonel his flight while escorting a fallen soldier's remains. This is how we treat our heroes. #Let him fly." Underneath it, the numbers were climbing. Retweets, comments, likes. It was catching fire. Then another tweet popped up. This one from a veterans advocacy group. "We are aware of the disgraceful incident happening at Airport Name. Our soldiers deserve better. Expect action." The crowd murmured, the realization sinking in. The airline had officially lost control of the narrative. The agent behind the counter, still frozen in place, let out a shaky breath. She turned and hurried toward the back, disappearing behind a frosted glass door. She wasn't coming back with an answer. She was coming back with damage control. Carter adjusted his hat. He had been in situations like this before. Not at an airport, not like this, but in places where powerful people suddenly realized they had made the wrong enemy. He wasn't smiling. He wasn't gloating. Because at the end of the day, this wasn't about him. It was about Private First Class Jason Reynolds, the young man waiting to go home. And right now, that mission was still incomplete. The crowd wasn't just watching anymore. They were waiting. The terminal felt different now, charged, expectant. Then the supervisor finally returned. But he wasn't alone. A second man walked beside him, this one in a sleek navy suit, his airline ID clipped neatly to his pocket. His walk was brisk, controlled, like someone used to putting out fires. He stopped just short of the counter, scanning the scene. His eyes darted between Carter, the Marine, and the rows of phones still recording. He cleared his throat. "Colonel, I apologize for the miscommunication. There seems to have been an error with our system, but we're working to get you on your flight as soon as possible." Miscommunication. Carter had been in the military long enough to know what that word really meant. It meant we got caught. It meant fix this before it costs us too much. He didn't respond right away. Instead, he let the moment hang, watching the airline representative shift slightly under the weight of the silence. "I see," Carter finally said, his voice measured. "An error, you said?" "Yes, sir. A regrettable mistake. We assure you it was not intentional." A few people in the crowd scoffed. The Marine shook his head. The airline rep adjusted his tie, clearly uncomfortable. "We'd like to personally escort you to the gate now, Colonel. First-class accommodations, of course." First class. As if that was the point. Carter looked past the man toward the counter where the agent still stood, looking anywhere but at him. The same agent who had smiled at him stiffly when she denied his flight. The same one who had never bothered to check before saying no. Carter exhaled slowly. "I appreciate the urgency," he said. "But I need to clarify something." The rep nodded quickly. "Of course." Carter's voice remained even. "If no one recorded this, if no one spoke up, would I still be standing here?" A beat of silence. The rep swallowed. "Sir, You don't need to answer," Carter interrupted. He already knew. Everyone in the terminal knew. Another moment of silence. Then a woman in the crowd murmured, "He's right." The rep tried to smooth over the tension. "Again, sir, we sincerely apologize." "We both know this isn't about an apology," Carter said. "It's about accountability." The crowd murmured in agreement. People weren't just angry anymore, they were disappointed. The rep knew he was losing control. He straightened his posture, adopting a more authoritative stance. "Colonel, let's get you on your flight now." But before Carter could respond, a new voice cut in. "Sir?" A younger man in an airport security uniform had appeared at the side of the counter. He held out a phone toward the airline rep, his expression tight. "I think you should see this." The rep frowned, taking the phone. He scrolled. His face paled. The Marine crossed his arms. "What? Something wrong?" The rep didn't answer, but Carter already knew. The backlash had officially exploded beyond the airport. A major news outlet had picked up the story. The headline was blunt. U.S. Army Colonel denied flight while escorting fallen soldier. Airline scrambles for answers. Below it, a video clip played. Footage from the terminal. The rep handed the phone back, inhaled sharply, and turned to Carter. "We deeply regret this situation." His voice was thinner now, forced. "We'd like to issue a public statement clarifying—" Carter cut him off. "The public already knows the truth." Silence. The rep pressed his lips together. Carter looked at the crowd, at the phone still recording. He turned back to the rep. "I don't need first class. I don't need special treatment. I need respect. And so does the soldier I'm escorting." Another murmur ran through the crowd. The rep gave a stiff nod as if that was all he could do now. "Understood, sir." The Marine let out a small, approving grunt. Carter adjusted his hat. "Now, let's finish this mission." But the consequences for the airline were just beginning. The airline had lost control of the situation. The story was out, spreading faster than they could contain it. The terminal felt more like a press conference now. Phones still recording, passengers still watching. Then, something unexpected happened. A man in a dark blue suit, with the unmistakable posture of someone with real authority, walked into the scene. He wasn't from the airline. He wasn't airport security. He was military. The room shifted. People moved aside instinctively as the man approached. His ID badge flashed briefly as he stepped up to Carter and extended his hand. "Colonel," he said firmly. "I'm Major Thomas Beckett, Department of the Army. We've been informed of the situation." Carter shook his hand, his grip strong. He didn't need to ask how the Major got here so quickly. The military doesn't play when it comes to its own. Beckett turned to the airline rep, his voice crisp. "We are handling this now. Colonel Carter and the remains of Private First Class Reynolds will not be flying commercial. The rep blinked. Sir, we were just about to... You were just about to cover your tracks, Beckett interrupted. His tone was polite, but it carried weight. He glanced at Carter. Sir, the Pentagon has arranged for a private military flight. Your transport is waiting. A murmur rippled through the crowd. People exchanged glances. The U.S. military had stepped in. Carter exhaled. Not out of relief. He didn't need saving. But because this mission was finally back on course, he gave a small nod. Understood, Major. Beckett's gaze flicked toward the airline rep one last time. This will be addressed. It wasn't a threat. It was a promise. Carter turned back to the Marine, who had been watching the entire exchange with satisfaction. Appreciate you, brother, Carter said. The Marine tipped his head. We look out for our own. Carter gave the room one last glance. The people who had spoken up, who had refused to let this slide, who had made sure this story was heard. He adjusted his uniform, squared his shoulders, and walked out, not toward the gate, but toward something bigger. But for the airline, the fallout was just getting started. The airline thought the situation would fade. A few apologies, a press release, maybe a statement from their CEO, damage control. But the public wasn't letting this go. News networks picked it up. Veterans organizations released statements condemning the airline's actions. Politicians weighed in, demanding accountability. Then came the financial hit. By the end of the week, the airline's stock had dropped. A trending hashtag calling for a boycott gained traction. Customers flooded their social media with demands for answers. And then, the final blow. A lawsuit. A coalition of military advocacy groups filed a formal complaint against the airline for discrimination and failure to uphold service member protections. Under pressure, the airline CEO made a public appearance. He called it a regrettable misunderstanding and announced that the employees involved had been placed on administrative leave. Too little, too late. Meanwhile, Colonel Carter continued his mission. He escorted Private First Class Jason Reynolds home, standing by as the young soldier's family received him for the last time. He didn't need the headlines. He didn't need the attention. He needed respect. And that was the real fight. Respect shouldn't be conditional. It shouldn't require a viral video or public outrage. It should be the standard. The people at that airport, the Marine, the passengers who spoke up, the ones who refused to stay silent, they proved something important. When people stand together, injustice has nowhere to hide. If you believe in accountability, if you believe in honoring those who serve, let your voice be heard. Because silence lets things like this happen again. And next time, it might not go viral.